Hello, let's read Wrapped in Memories. Wrapped in Memories. There you are! Lindsay jumped at her mom's voice. Ah! She screamed. I had a feeling you'd be in here, her mom said. You fell asleep in this closet playing hide and seek. I just sent your friends home, and your dinner is on the table getting cold. Lindsay crawled out, stood up, rubbed her eyes, and pulling the quilt she'd found tightly around her, walked slowly into the kitchen. Her mother, seeing her wrapped up in the old quilt, looked surprised, then a little sad for some reason. But she smiled at Lindsay and asked, What are you doing wearing Great-Grandma's quilt? I haven't seen that for such a long time. I like it, Lindsay replied. How come it was in the closet? I was going to fix it up last year and then show it to Great-Grandma when I finished, but there was never time. And then she passed away. Can I keep it, please? I'm cold and it's warm. Besides, it would be nice to have something from Great-Grandma in my room. That's fine, her mother said. While Lindsay ate her dinner, she studied the quilt. She picked up the bottom of the quilt to wrap it around her feet and noticed some stitching in the corner. It read, Wrap up in this when you are cold. The story of my life it will unfold. It has warmed my heart, but now I'm old. This I leave you. It's worth more than gold. Lindsay was so excited. Mom, she called, come look at this. Her mom rushed into the kitchen and said, What's going on now? Lindsay showed her the label on the quilt and read it to her. What does it mean? Are we rich? Lindsay's mom tried not to laugh and said, We're hardly rich. This quilt belonged to my grandma, your great-grandma. Grandma gave it to me when I got married, and we've used it so much it's almost threadbare in spots. It's certainly not worth money, but those words do mean something special. Why don't you think about it for a few days and see if you can figure out the mystery? The next day it was snowing giant snowflakes, and it was cold. Lindsay wanted to find out what the label on the quilt meant, so she was determined to walk to her grandma's house after school to see what she knew. Lindsay grabbed the quilt and tried to fold it small enough to fit in her backpack. No such luck. She rolled it up and she scrunched it up and she bunched it up. She tried every which way, but it just wouldn't fit. So she did the only thing she could. She put on her backpack, then wrapped the old quilt around her, and out the door she went. She was quite a sight to see. She looked like a giant patchwork creature with a hump on its back trudging down the street. She met up with her friends, Callie, Gracie, and Connor, and they laughed and laughed. Lindsay suddenly felt embarrassed, but then she thought of how much her mother loved the quilt. Laugh all you want, but there is a secret in this quilt, Lindsay said more loudly than their laughter. Lindsay pulled the quilt tighter around her, squared her shoulders, and read the label to her friends. They stopped laughing, and their eyes were as big as donut holes. Gold! Wow! Does that mean you're rich? Callie asked. No, Lindsay said, breathing a sigh of relief that they had stopped laughing. And then she told them her plan to find out what it meant. After school, Grandma was standing in front of the big window in the living room when Lindsay tromped into view. When Grandma saw the giant patchwork hump moving down her driveway, she didn't know what to think. Then she recognized Lindsay underneath the quilt. Grandma started laughing, but it was the kind of laugh that comes from being happy. She threw open the door and invited the quilt monster in. It's been ages since I've seen that quilt, said Grandma as she helped Lindsay off with her coat and boots. "And I've come to ask you about its mysterious message," said Lindsay. "Come and sit down, and I'll tell you all about this quilt. My mother, your great-grandmother, made this quilt, and these little scraps of fabric were sewn by hand. Do you see?" she said, pointing to the tiny, even stitches. "Your great-grandmother didn't shop in a fabric store like we do today. She cut up whatever old clothing she had to make this quilt. I remember she worked on this for a very long time, probably years. This is your great-grandmother's life in these little scraps of fabric. Just look at this green and red piece. This used to be a tablecloth that we used at Christmas every year for our breakfast. Your great-grandmother used to make the best waffles for Christmas morning. She always used orange juice instead of milk, and they were heavenly. I'd forgotten all about that until just now. One day I'll make them for you." Pointing to a piece of fabric with black and white check on it, Grandma said, "This was cut from my baby blanket. I used to sleep with that blanket until I was 12 years old. Then my daddy brought home a brand new wringer washing machine, and the first time my blanket was washed after that, it got caught in the wringer and ripped into shreds. I was so sad, but my mother said she would save a piece for me, and here it is." After an hour of talking about the quilt, Grandma said, "Lindsay, I want you to leave this quilt here with me, and I'm going to try to fix it. Your mom has been so busy since your great-grandma died. I want to do this as a surprise for her. I think she misses seeing her grandma, and maybe fixing up this old quilt will remind her that her grandma isn't far away, and that she'll see her again." To Grandma's surprise, Lindsay asked if she could help. Grandma studied Lindsay's face. Lindsay was so young, but Grandma thought she was old enough to learn, so she said, "Yes, I'll let you help. There's so much of our family story here. You and I are going to have a great time restoring this lovely treasure." Every Wednesday afternoon, Lindsay would walk over to Grandma's house, and the two of them would work on the quilt. Grandma taught Lindsay how to thread a needle, tie a knot, hide the knot under the fabric, and how to sew so that the thread was hiding under the fabric. Every week for 3 months they stitched, talked, laughed, and grew closer than ever before as they worked on the quilt. They talked about many things, but usually they talked about the great lady who made the quilt. Lindsay learned that her great-grandmother had lived on a farm and raised chickens and goats and 9 children. Her great-grandmother didn't have a television, a computer, or even a telephone. Lindsay tried to think about what that would be like, but it seemed impossible to her that someone could actually live without a phone. Lindsay also learned that her great-grandmother had made every meal from scratch. She milked cows, grew her own vegetables, and occasionally rode a horse to the store and to church. She loved hearing the stories while she worked on the quilt, and she especially loved spending time with her grandma. They also talked about Lindsay's mom. Together, they chose a piece of fabric from Lindsay's mom's baptism dress. They talked about when Lindsay would get baptized next year. Grandma said she was proud of Lindsay for being baptized, and that keeping the commandments after baptism would make it so they could all be together forever. That was Grandma's favorite subject. She always liked to say that nothing was forever except families. So Lindsay suggested they embroider the words, "Families are forever," on a piece of the quilt, and Grandma thought that was a great idea. Spring had finally arrived, and just as the flowers were blooming, the quilt was finished. Lindsay was so excited to show her mom, and on the perfect day after school, they took the quilt to her. "What's this?" Mom asked, surprised. Grandma didn't say a word. She just smiled with pride as Lindsay opened the box and carefully unfolded the old quilt. "Oh, it's so beautiful," her mom gasped. "You did such a wonderful job." Lindsay began talking excitedly. "Look, Mom, this is a piece of your old prom dress, remember? Grandma used it to replace a ripped piece of fabric. And look at this up here. It's from one of Great-Grandma's house coats." Grandma said, "Show her the seashells patch, the one from your baby blessing dress." Lindsay searched the bottom of the quilt until she found it. "And look at this one, Mom. It has chickens on it. Did you know Great-Grandma raised chickens and sold the eggs so she'd have extra money? And you know how I love green apples? Well, so did Great-Grandma. She used to pick apples and make applesauce too. Oh, where is that patch?" She quickly spotted it near the center of the quilt and pointed out the little piece of fabric with lime green apples on it. There was so much to tell. Every corner of the quilt had a story in it, and Lindsay wanted her mom to hear every one. After admiring the quilt for almost an hour, Lindsay carefully folded it up, and the four of them had a group hug: Grandma, Mom, Lindsay, and the quilt. Grandma and Mom squeezed Lindsay so tightly she thought she was going to pop. When she looked up at them, she saw they both had tears in their eyes and smiles on their faces just like her. When Lindsay's mom came to tuck her in that night, she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the quilt her daughter and her mother had worked so hard on. She could almost hear her grandma's voice as she read the label to herself. She said, "Lindsay, do you remember when you first read this label and you asked me if we were rich?" "Yes," Lindsay answered, "and you said we weren't." "Well, we are rich," said her mom, "very rich indeed. Having your great-grandma and your grandma in our lives makes us rich, and it's through the gospel that we can be together forever as a family. And just like Great-Grandma's label said, that's something money just can't buy." She kissed Lindsay goodnight, tucked the warm quilt up around her, and turned off the light. And Lindsay felt just as warm inside as she did on the outside. And that was a special story called Wrapped in Memories. And I hope you enjoyed it.